The HOA meeting was a bloodbath, and I was the one holding the mop. Article 7, Section 3. Ava Winters rasped, her voice cutting through the humid air of the community center like a piano wire. The height of a residential flagpole is a matter of civil discipline, Mr. Bond, not personal expression. I stood there in my sensible khakis, clutching a lukewarm cup of decaf and wearing the face of a man who found a $50 fine for glare hazards deeply distressing. To the 30 angry retirees in the room, I was Abe Bond, a bumbling insurance actuary who couldn't grow a dandelion to save his life. To the woman at the podium, I was a nuisance. To Moscow, I was the man sent to kill her. I watched her through the steam of my coffee. She looked magnificent in her fury. Her hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to tension her very soul. She was lecturing the room on aesthetic integrity with the same chilling precision she'd once used to dismantle NATO intelligence rings in Brussels. She had gone native. The legendary Elena Sokolova, the SVR's premier shadow, had traded the great game for the petty one. She wasn't just hiding in the suburbs, she was colonizing them. She wanted to be mayor. She wanted the spotlight. And in our world, the spotlight is just a target with a different name. The rules are not suggestions, Abe, she said, her eyes locking onto mine with a slate gray coldness that made my blood turn to ice. In this community, we cultivate order. Without order, there is only the rubbish heap. She didn't know that my basement was currently filled with the very rubbish that would end her. Encrypted dossiers, surveillance feeds of her campaign fundraisers, and a direct order from the Politburo to liquidate the asset before her ego burned the entire cell. I offered her a sheepish Abe smile. You're right, President Winters. Symmetry is everything. I sat down, feeling the weight of the suppressed Makarov in the small of my back. The audit was coming to Shady Oaks. One of us was going to be deleted by sunset. And as I looked at the perfectly manicured lawn on the campaign poster behind her, I realized the most dangerous thing about Ava Winters wasn't her training. It was her mulch. Today's story is from Abe Bond, a man composed entirely of deliberate beige and a professional ghost, whose true self was long ago hollowed out to make room for the motherland's shifting needs. A veteran handler for the SVR, he operates with a soul-deep world tiredness and a dry, serrated sarcasm that serves as his only shield against the absurdity of his trade. He doesn't do what he does out of soaring patriotism or a love for the great game. He does it because he is a creature of momentum and duty, a man who knows that in the cold calculus of espionage, someone has to be the one to turn out the lights. To Abe, people are not neighbors or friends. They are assets to be maintained, liabilities to be mitigated, or chips that must fly when the forest is finally cut down. The inside of his head is a filing cabinet where the folders are all mislabeled on purpose. When he looks at a sunset, he's not thinking about the colors. He's calculating the exact moment the ambient light drops enough to make a thermal optic effective. It's an exhausting way to live. But then again, Abe Bond doesn't actually exist, so he doesn't really get to complain about being tired. Before we dive into today's story, if you like tales like this, smash that like button now. Comment below on where you're listening from and what you would have done if you were in Abe's situation. And tell me where you're listening from. I'm more than wanting to know where in the world you are and what you think. And tell me if you like these left-of-center HOA stories. But now, let's hear Abe's story, as told in his own words. The air in Privet Close tasted like freshly mown Kentucky bluegrass and expensive, lingering anxiety. It was a sterile, engineered scent that didn't belong to a man like me. In my previous life, I'd breathed in the copper tang of spent shell casings and the damp rot of safe houses in the Balkans. Now, apparently, I was an aficionado of suburban perfection. I stood on the driveway of number 371, watching the hydraulic ramp of the moving truck hiss as it lowered toward the asphalt. My hands, calloused from years of things the residents of this cul-de-sac would never approve of, felt heavy in the pockets of my brand new charcoal gray chinos. I was the picture of a mid-level actuarial consultant. Sensible shoes, a neutral polo shirt, and a face so forgettable it was practically a superpower. I'd spent 3 weeks in a safe house in Virginia scrubbing the grit of the Donetsk Basin out from under my fingernails and practicing my American laugh, a sound that always felt like it was coming from a different room. My instructions had been simple. Blend in, evaluate the asset, and wait for the signal. It was a dance I'd done a dozen times before, and usually it ended with a quiet disappearance or a loud bang. I was tired, in a way that sleep didn't quite reach, but the motherland didn't care about my circadian rhythms. Mr. Bond? The voice was like a piano wire being pulled taut. I didn't jump. People like me don't jump. We just transition into a state of heightened awareness that looks, to the untrained eye, like a polite turn of the head. I adjusted my Abe mask. Jovial, slightly slow on the uptake. The kind of guy who finds a good deal on bulk paper towels exhilarating. She was standing on the sidewalk, exactly 6 feet from my property line. She held a heavy plastic clipboard against her chest like a tactical shield. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes upward, giving her the look of a predatory bird. This was Ava Winters. To the new recruits at the academy outside Moscow, she was a ghost story told in reverent whispers. She was the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a NATO intelligence ring in Brussels in '94 without leaving a single fingerprint. She was a legend of the old guard, a master of tradecraft who could blend into a room like oxygen. To the people of this street, however, she was just the woman who sent registered mail if your bin lids didn't close all the way. That would be me, I said, offering a practiced, slightly awkward smile. You must be the neighbor. I'm Abe. Just moved in from Cincinnati. Well, via a few other places, but Cincinnati is where I tell people I'm from. I waited for a glimmer of recognition, a coded phrase, a twitch of a finger that said, I know why you're here. Nothing. Her eyes remained as flat as a Siberian winter. I'm the president, she corrected, ignoring my outstretched hand. Her eyes, cold, slate gray, and devoid of any recognition, swept over my moving truck. They didn't linger on the heavy crates that held my encrypted comms or the false-bottom trunk tucked behind the sofa. They stopped on the rear passenger tire of the truck. Your vehicle is encroaching on the communal curb easement, Mr. Bond. Article 4, Section 2 of the Shady Oaks Charter. Commercial vehicles are not permitted to remain stationary for more than 4 hours, and they must never impede the visual flow of the streetscape. I looked at the tire. It was perhaps 2 inches over an invisible line marked by the change in concrete texture. I could have explained that the driver was currently trying to wrestle a very heavy, very illegal radio transmitter up the stairs, but instead, I just sighed. I'm sorry, I said, keeping my voice at a humble, slightly bumbling pitch. I'll have the drivers move it as soon as they finish the heavy lifting. I didn't realize the easements were so precise. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Wouldn't want to upset the visual flow. The rules are not suggestions, she said. She didn't raise her voice, but there was a rhythmic, clipped quality to her English. It was the English of someone who had studied the language as a tactical weapon. In this community, we cultivate order. Without order, there is only the rubbish heap, and I will not have my neighborhood become a rubbish heap. She reached into a folder on her clipboard and pulled out a bright yellow slip of paper. She stepped forward and tucked it under the windshield wiper of the moving truck with a sharp, decisive flick. A formal warning, she said. Consider it a welcome gift. It's better to learn the boundaries now than to find yourself on the wrong side of a lien. We take our aesthetic integrity very seriously here, Mr. Bond. I expect your lawn to be addressed by Saturday. The dandelions at the edge of your porch are already in violation of the height restrictions. 3 inches is the limit. Yours are closer to 4. I'll get right on that, I said, my voice dripping with a dry sarcasm she didn't seem to register. Wouldn't want my dandelions to stage a revolution. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic, military beat against the pavement. She didn't look back. I watched her go, recognizing the level shoulders and the efficient stride. It was heartbreaking, in a professional sense. Seeing a once great operative obsessing over the height of a weed was like watching a grandmaster play tiddlywinks. I looked down at the yellow slip. A $50 citation for visual obstruction. I leaned against my mailbox and felt the familiar, heavy weight of the inevitable. Moscow had sent me here because they were worried she was losing her mind, drawing too much heat. Looking at that ticket, I realized they were right, but for the wrong reasons. She hadn't lost her mind. She'd just traded the great game for the petty one. I knew how this ended. I'd seen the black vans before. I'd written the reports. I wanted to believe there was a version of this where she stayed the president and I stayed the bumbling neighbor, but the SVR didn't do retirement plans for legends who went rogue over lawn care. They did liquidations. I took a deep breath of that bluegrass air and looked at the yellow slip again. $50. It was a hell of a price for a front row seat to a funeral. The basement of the house was damp, dark, and smelled of the previous owner's failed dreams of home carpentry. To anyone else, it was a storage space. To me, it was the only place in this town where I didn't have to pretend that a sale on patio furniture was the highlight of my week. I sat in the glow of a single LED lamp, the blue light reflecting off the high-resolution scans of Ava's dossier. I'd seen her file 100 times in Moscow, but reading it here with the muffled sound of a suburban lawnmower buzzing somewhere down the street made it feel like a work of historical fiction. The woman in the dossier was a predator. In 1998, she had operated under the name Elena Sokolova in Paris. There was a photo of her leaving a cafe near the Place de la Bastille, eyes sharp, a trench coat pulled tight, her posture screaming of a woman who could disappear into a crowd of three. She had been the SVR's premier scalpel, used for delicate removals and impossible extractions. She spoke 7 languages, could hotwire a Mercedes in 12 seconds, and once spent 48 hours in a crawlspace in Prague just to confirm a target's eye color. I looked up from the screen and toward the small, rectangular window at the top of the basement wall. I could just see the bottom of Ava's driveway next door. The woman in the driveway was currently wearing a sun hat and sensible gardening gloves. She wasn't holding a silenced Makarov. She was holding a plastic bottle of industrial-strength weed killer. She was staring at a patch of clover near her mailbox with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred that she used to reserve for enemies of the state. The dossier said she was a master of the long game, the ability to maintain a cover for decades without a single slip. But this wasn't a cover anymore. This was a metamorphosis. "You've gone soft, Elena," I whispered to the empty room. I navigated to the section of the file detailing her psychological profile: high adaptability, low emotional variance, tendency toward total environmental control. That last part was the anchor. In the field, controlling the environment meant knowing where every exit was and who was carrying a concealed weapon. In Shady Oaks, it meant ensuring that no one used a non-approved mulch. I watched her through the monitor of the small pinhole camera I'd tucked into my own mailbox. She was measuring something. She had a literal ruler out, checking the distance between her curb and a neighbor's recycling bin. The contrast was jarring. The dossier described a woman who had once navigated a high-speed chase through the narrow streets of Istanbul without breaking a sweat. Now, she looked like she was on the verge of a stroke because the bin was 4 inches too far to the left. Moscow was worried she was drawing heat. Looking at her now, I could see why. An operative is supposed to be a ghost, a ripple in the water that disappears instantly. Ava Winters was a localized hurricane. She wasn't just living in Shady Oaks. She was colonizing it. I'd seen this before with the old-timers, the deep sickness. They spend so long pretending to be someone else that the original person just evaporates. They stop reporting because there's nothing left to report. The mission becomes the lawn. The motherland becomes the HOA board. I pulled up a scan of her latest HOA newsletter. She'd written a 3-page editorial on the scourge of unshielded exterior lighting. It was written with the same cold, analytical precision she used to use for CDREP reports on NATO troop movements. I leaned back, the springs of my cheap office chair creaking in the silence. My job was to find the crack, the moment where the legend slipped and the liability began. But as I watched her march back toward her house, clipboard in hand, I realized the crack wasn't a slip. The crack was that she was happy. She had found a world small enough for her to rule completely, and she would kill anyone who tried to take it away from her, including me. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes. I'd have to start the ingratiation phase tomorrow. I'd pay the $50 fine, maybe buy some of that high-end fertilizer she liked, and play the role of the bumbling, compliant neighbor. I looked back at the screen, at the young, cold-eyed Elena in Paris. I wondered if she'd hate the woman in the sun hat as much as I was starting to pity her. "Trust, but verify," I muttered, closing the laptop. "And for God's sake, Abe, remember to trim the hedges." I decided to give her a test violation. Something subtle enough to pass for bachelor incompetence, but visible enough to trigger her predatory instincts. I chose the trash cans. According to the Shady Oaks Charter, Article 9, bins were to be removed from the curb no later than 6 p.m. on collection day. It was 7:15 p.m. I sat in my darkened kitchen, sipping a lukewarm coffee and watching the digital clock on the microwave. At 7:16 p.m., A shadow detached itself from the impeccably manicured hedges of number 369. Ava didn't walk. She patrolled. She was wearing a beige windbreaker and carrying a high-lumen tactical flashlight that she probably told the HOA board was for safety walks. She stopped in front of my driveway, the beam of her light cutting through the dusk like a searchlight at a border crossing. It landed on my plastic bins with the weight of a physical blow. I gave it 30 seconds, then stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the light. "Oh, hey there, President Winters," I called out, my voice thick with the practiced Midwestern cheer of a man who didn't have a care in the world. Caught me red-handed. I got caught up in a marathon of that home renovation show. You know how it is. Once they start knocking down the load-bearing walls, you can't look away. Ava didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She kept the light trained on the bins, then slowly panned it up to my face. "The schedule is not a suggestion, Mr. Bond," she said, her voice dropping into that low, resonant register I remembered from the tapes of her interrogation sessions in the 90s. "Order is a fragile thing. If one house fails to retreat, the entire street loses its discipline. It is a slow rot." "You're absolutely right," I said, trotting down the driveway with a sheepish grin. "I'll get these tucked away right now. No harm, no foul, right?" I reached for the handle of the bin, but she stepped into my personal space, a move designed to assert dominance. She was close enough that I could smell the faint, sharp scent of lavender detergent and something metallic, gun oil. The legend still cleaned her equipment, even if she only used it to prune her roses now. "Give a person a finger, and they'll take the whole hand," she muttered. I froze for a heartbeat. She'd said it in English, but the structure was a literal ghost of the Russian day palettes Otkusit Ruku. It was a glitch, a tiny, linguistic slip that suggested the Ava OS was running on top of a much older, much more violent hardware. "I'm sorry?" I asked, tilting my head. "That's not a Cincinnati saying. It's got a nice ring to it." She stiffened, her eyes narrowing as if she were suddenly aware of the words that had escaped her. For a second, I saw it. The flash of the operative behind the suburban mask. She was evaluating me, checking for a double meaning. I kept my expression as blank and amiable as a fresh coat of eggshell white paint. "It is a common-sense saying," she snapped, recovering her poise. "It means that leniency is the mother of failure. If I allow you an extra hour tonight, tomorrow you will leave your bins out until noon. By next week, Shady Oaks looks like a tenement." "Point taken," I said, starting to wheel the bin back toward the garage. "I appreciate the firm hand, Ava. Truly. It's nice to know someone's watching out for us." "Someone is always watching, Mr. Bond," she said. She stayed on the sidewalk, watching me retreat like a sentry guarding a perimeter. "And don't think I haven't noticed the mulch you delivered this afternoon. It's the dyed red variety. We only permit natural cedar or dark brown. It's in the supplementary bylaws." I stopped at the garage door and looked back. She was still there, a silhouette against the streetlights, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a baton. "I'll return it first thing in the morning," I promised, giving her a little mock salute. As I pulled the garage door down, I leaned against the cold metal and let the Abe smile slide off my face. My heart was thumping, not from fear, but from the thrill of the find. She had glitched. The language was breaking down. She was so deep in her own theater of power that she was starting to forget which script she was supposed to be reading. I went back to the basement and pulled up the dossier. I added a single line to the psychological deviation section. Subject is beginning to translate internal tactical maxims into local vernacular. Identity bleed is confirmed. Liability rating increasing. I looked at the red mulch sitting in bags by the door. It was going to cost me $100 to swap it out, and the SVR auditors were going to scream about the expense report. But it was worth it. I was finally under her skin. The SVR's black budget is a marvel of international finance, a complex web of shell companies in Cyprus, offshore accounts in the Caymans, and laundered dividends from state-owned energy firms. It is designed to fund coups by politicians and maintain deep cover cells for decades. It is not, I reflected while staring at a spreadsheet, designed to buy 2,000 custom-printed door hangers that say Winters for Mayor, bringing HOA discipline to City Hall. By the end of my first month, I'd achieved trusted subordinate status. It turns out the fastest way to a tyrant's heart is to be the only person who actually reads the bylaws. I had become Ava's unofficial campaign adjutant, a role that mostly involved me sitting in her war room, a dining room that smelled of furniture polish and suppressed rage, and organizing her donations. Abe, the numbers for the Kensington district are soft, Ava said, without looking up from her laptop. She was wearing a crisp, navy blazer that looked suspiciously like a uniform. The residents there are resistant to the proposed mandatory quiet hours ordinance. They claim it interferes with their weekend social lives. People can be so selfish, I said, my voice dripping with the dry, world-weary sarcasm that was becoming my only hobby. Imagine wanting to talk at a reasonable volume on your own patio after 9 p.m. It's practically anarchy. Ava finally looked up. Her eyes searched mine for a flicker of dissent, but I gave her nothing but the blank, helpful stare of a man who found zoning laws erotic. Order is not a buffet, Abe, she said, her voice dropping into that chilling, authoritative rasp. You do not pick and choose which parts of civilization you wish to uphold. To sit on two chairs is to fall on your, how do you say, your backside. Another glitch. Sedet na dvuk stulyak. She was practically bleeding Russian idioms now, translating them in real time as her stress levels rose with the polling data. I'll get the flyers out to Kensington tonight, I promised. But Ava, speaking of order, I've been looking at the HOA's Restricted Improvement Fund. There's a significant transfer, nearly $10,000, labeled as Beautification Consulting. The recipient is the same company printing your campaign signs. The room went very still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a grandfather clock that Ava probably regulated with a stopwatch. Beautification is a broad term, Mr. Bond, she said slowly. She didn't look back at the screen. She watched me, her hand resting flat on the table. It was the posture of someone ready to draw a knife from under the mahogany. A city that is managed like Shady Oaks is a beautiful city. The funds are being utilized to ensure the message of aesthetic integrity reaches every voter. Of course, I said, holding up my hands in a don't shoot gesture. I just worry about the optics. If a local journalist, or heaven forbid the IRS, starts poking into the HOA's books, they might find the consulting fees a bit creative. And we wouldn't want anyone looking too closely at the original grant that funded this development back in the 90s, would we? I was pushing it. I was leaning right on the bruise. Ava leaned forward, the light from the chandelier reflecting in her pupils. Do not teach a learned one, Abe. I have managed budgets that would make your head spin. I have built worlds out of nothing. Do you think I fear a tax auditor from the county? I think you should fear anything that brings the light, I said, dropping the bumbling act just an inch. Light is for garden parties, Ava, not for us. She stared at me then, really stared at me. For a second, the HOA president vanished, and I saw the legend, the woman who had navigated the shadows of the Cold War. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp suspicion, as if she were seeing a shape in the fog that shouldn't be there. Then, the mask snapped back into place. The soup is not yet cooked, she said, her voice dismissive. Go. Deliver the flyers. And make sure you don't walk on the grass in Kensington. They're very touchy about the turf. I stood up, gathered the stack of Winters for Mayor propaganda, and walked out into the humid evening air. As I walked toward my car, I checked the small, encrypted device in my pocket. I'd successfully mirrored her hard drive while she was busy lecturing me on the importance of uniform mailbox fonts. Back in my basement, I sent the update to Moscow. Subject is embezzling operational funds to finance a local political career. High risk of federal discovery. Subject is prioritizing personal ego over cell security. Recommendation: prepare for extraction. The asset is no longer an asset. She is a liability with a gavel. I looked at the for sale sign I'd hidden behind my furnace. I had a feeling I'd be hammering it into the lawn sooner than I thought. The private investigator's name was Miller, and he was as subtle as a brick through a window. I spotted him on Tuesday afternoon, sitting in a silver sedan with tinted windows parked 3 houses down from 371, Privet Close. To the average resident, he was just a bored contractor waiting for a client. To me, the way he adjusted his side mirror every time Ava's front door opened was a neon sign. Apparently, Ava's opponent in the mayoral race, a local developer who preferred asphalt to aesthetics, had decided to do some digging. I spent the afternoon in my basement, watching Miller through the long-range lens I'd mounted behind a fake birdhouse on my porch. He was good, but he was American private sector good. He didn't know how to look for a ghost. He was looking for a paper trail. And in the world of Ava Winters, The paper trail was a minefield of SVR-funded shell companies. The problem wasn't that he'd find out she was a spy. The problem was that he'd find out she didn't exist before 1994. Damn it, Ava, I muttered, watching Miller snap a photo of her campaign manager leaving her house. You've invited a wolf into the fold because you wanted to play at being a lion. If Miller pulled her social security thread, the whole sweater would unravel. The FBI would be on the cul-de-sac by Friday, and I'd be lucky if I made it to the border in a crate. I had to neutralize him, not with a bullet, but with the kind of suburban theater Ava excelled at. I waited until dusk, then pulled on my Abe windbreaker and headed out for a neighborly jog. I made sure to look winded as I trotted past his car, then doubled back and tapped on his window with a friendly, gormless grin. Miller rolled the window down just a crack. "Can I help you?" "Oh, hey," I panted, leaning my hands on my knees. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Abe, from 371. I saw you sitting here and thought maybe you were the guy I called about the tree roots. My oak is lifting the sidewalk, and the HOA president, that's Mrs. Winters over there, she's been on my back well, like something very heavy on a back." Miller's eyes sharpened. "You live next door to Ava Winters?" "Unfortunately," I said, wiping fake sweat from my brow. "Listen, if you're a reporter or something, you should be careful. She's got eyes everywhere. She once fined a kid $50 because his lemonade stand didn't have a commercial health permit. Between you and me, she's a bit of a brick face. Never shows a hint of what she's thinking." Another deliberate slip. "Stilat mordu kirpachom." I wanted to see if he was sharp enough to catch the odd phrasing. He wasn't. He was too hungry for the dirt. "I'm just doing some research," Miller said, his tone turning conspiratorial. "You noticed anything odd? Unexplained income? Strange visitors?" "Visitors? No," I lied, looking around nervously. "But she's always at that consulting firm in the city. Volga Strategic Solutions, I think it's called. She says it's for her campaign, but she spends more time there than at the HOA office." I gave him the name of a defunct SVR shell company I'd spent the last hour reactivating from my basement. It was a honeypot, a digital dead end filled with forged, boring tax returns and dead-end phone numbers. It would keep him busy for a week, and by the time he realized it was a ghost, the election would be over. "Volga Strategic?" Miller scribbled it down. "Thanks, Abe. You're a patriot." "Just want my sidewalk fixed without a subpoena," I chirped. I jogged away, feeling the familiar, oily slickness of a successful misdirection. But as I reached my driveway, the front door of 369 snapped open. Ava was standing there, silhouetted by the warm, amber light of her foyer. "Mr. Bond," she called out. The word hung in the air like a threat. I walked over to the edge of her lawn. "Evening, Ava. Just getting the cardio in. Heart health is a community responsibility, right?" She stepped down onto the grass, her eyes flicking toward the silver sedan down the street. "You were talking to the man in the car. The eyes are afraid, but the hands are doing, Abe. You look nervous." Glaza Boyatzia, a rookie delayut. She was telling me she saw through my jogger act. She thought I was the one being sloppy. "He's a tree guy," I said, keeping my voice light, "trying to save my oak." "He is a scavenger," Ava said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "He is looking for a crack in the wall. I have spent 30 years building this wall, and I will not have a soaked hen like you inviting him to peck at the mortar." "I was helping you, Ava," I said, dropping the jovial tone for a heartbeat. "He's gone now, or he will be soon." She stepped closer, her face inches from mine. For the first time, I didn't see the HOA president. I saw the girl from the Paris dossier, the one who would kill a man for looking at her the wrong way. "I do not need help from a neighbor who cannot even keep his trash cans on the correct side of the line," she whispered. "The mountain does not meet the mountain, Abe, but man meets man. Remember that." She turned and marched back inside, the heavy oak doors slamming shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. I stood on the sidewalk, the evening chill finally settling in. She knew, or she suspected. She was so deep in her own paranoia that she was starting to see the handler behind the neighbor. I looked down the street. Miller's car was already pulling away, chasing the ghost of Volga Strategic. He was safe. For now. But Ava was becoming something else. She wasn't just native anymore. She was feral. I went back to my basement and opened the dossier. I didn't add a note this time. I just looked at the for sale sign in the corner and wondered if I'd have time to pack my books before the black van arrived. The SVR doesn't send emails when they're angry. They send delivery drivers. On Thursday morning, a brown van that looked suspiciously like a courier service pulled into my driveway. The man who stepped out was wearing a generic uniform, but he moved with the tight, economical grace of a Spetsnaz veteran. He didn't carry a clipboard. He carried a small, heavy package and a look of profound irritation. I met him in the garage, out of sight of Ava's ring cameras. Abe Bond? He asked, his English flat and practiced. That's the name on the mortgage, I said, leaning against my workbench. You have something for me? He handed me the package. It wasn't a bomb. It was a secure comms tablet, preloaded with a very angry audit. Moscow is tired of the special assessments, Abe. They're asking why the budget for a destabilization cell is being spent on premium mulch and candidate branding. They think you've lost control of the asset. The asset is the one with the gavel, I said, my voice dry. I'm just the guy paying the fines to keep her from calling the FBI on us. Fix it, he said, his eyes flicking toward Ava's house. Or we will send someone who doesn't mind the visual obstruction of a body bag. He left without a signature. I took the tablet to the basement and opened the file. It was worse than I thought. The Politburo had traced the latest beautification transfer. They weren't just mad about the money. They were terrified of the trail. Ava was using a bank in the city that had been flagged by the Treasury for unusual activity. She was effectively shining a spotlight on the cell's heart just so she could buy a 30-second radio spot. I spent the rest of the day prepping for the campaign's strategy session. Ava's dining room had been transformed. Maps of the voting districts were pinned to the walls with the same tactical precision as a battle map of the Fulda Gap. She was standing at the head of the table, a red pen in her hand, marking hostile neighborhoods with aggressive X's. The Kensington flyers were a failure, Abe, she said, the moment I walked in. She didn't look up. The residents are still talking about personal liberty. They're beating the buckets. Bit baklushi? Wasting time. Maybe they just like their loud music, Ava, I suggested, taking my seat. It's a cultural thing. Culture is what happens when people are too lazy to be disciplined, she snapped. She slammed the pen down and looked at me. I need more funding for the quality of life mailers. I want a flyer in every mailbox that details the specific fines for noise violations. Fear is a great educator. The well is running dry, I said, watching her carefully. My consultancy funds are tapped out, Ava, and the HOA board is starting to ask why the lawn maintenance budget is down 40%. Ava leaned over the table, her eyes burning with a feverish, messianic light. Let them ask. Once I am mayor, I will dissolve the board. I will fold the city's code enforcement into a single, unified department. I will not be questioned by part-time volunteers in golf shirts. She wasn't just native anymore. She was building a kingdom. The legend had decided that the shadows were too small for her. She wanted the sun, even if it burned her to a crisp. The soup is not yet cooked, I reminded her, using her own phrase. If you push too hard now, you'll trigger an audit. A real one. Not a tree guy in a silver sedan. Ava laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. You think like a clerk, Abe. You see a budget. I see a destiny. You worry about the soaked hens in Moscow. She stopped. The silence in the room became absolute. The grandfather clock ticked once, twice. She had slipped. She hadn't said the board or the committee. She had said Moscow. She looked at me, her face a brick face of frozen horror. For a split second, the veil dropped. She knew that I knew, and she knew exactly what I was. I mean, the residents, she stammered, her voice regaining its suburban lilt, but the damage was done. The residents who think they can dictate my pace. Of course, I said, my voice as smooth as silk. The residents, they can be so demanding. I stood up, gathering my things. I'll see what I can do about the funding, President. But remember, the higher the bird flies, the easier it is for the hawk to see. I walked out of the house, my heart racing. She hadn't just glitched. She had confessed. The Abe mask was still on, but the Ava mask was cracked beyond repair. She was a legend who had forgotten the first rule of the game: never fall in love with your own lie. I went back to my house and looked at the for sale sign. I didn't hide it behind the furnace this time. I left it by the back door. Moscow wouldn't wait much longer, and neither would she. The strategic planning session had morphed into something far more dangerous: a cocktail party. Ava decided that to win the soft voters of the Kensington district, she needed to play the role of the gracious hostess. Her living room was a sea of sensible cardigans and expensive wine. I moved through the crowd with a tray of bacon-wrapped dates, playing the part of the helpful, slightly dim-witted neighbor. To the guests, I was just Abe, the bachelor who couldn't grow a dandelion to save his life. To Ava, I was a ghost at the feast. We hadn't spoken about the Moscow slip. We were professionals, after all. We simply layered more theater on top of the rot. "You're doing a wonderful job, Abe," Ava said, gliding past me. She paused to adjust a single date on my tray, moving it exactly half an inch to the left. Her touch was icy. "The presentation is everything. Without symmetry, the palette is confused." "Symmetry is my middle name," I replied with a dry smile. "Or it would be if the HOA didn't have a rule against non-traditional middle names." She didn't laugh. Her eyes were constantly scanning the room, not for voters, but for threats. She was working the room with the same predatory focus she'd once used to work a safe house. While she was busy cornering a local councilman near the piano, I made my move. I knew the layout of 369, Privet Close, better than she thought. I'd spent enough nights in my basement studying her floor plans. There was a small room off the back of the kitchen, ostensibly a pantry, that always remained locked. I slipped away from the party, the noise of clinking glasses and forced laughter fading into a dull hum. The lock on the pantry door was a high-end Medeco. It was the kind of lock a suburban mom buys when she's hiding a wine habit, or when a KGB legend is hiding her soul. It took me 6 seconds. I stepped inside and closed the door, the darkness thick with the smell of old paper and ozone. I clicked on a small pen light. It wasn't a pantry. One wall was lined with filing cabinets, each one meticulously labeled with the names of every resident in Shady Oaks. This was her black file room. She had dirt on everyone: unpaid taxes, secret affairs, minor legal infractions. It was a local version of the Lubyanka archives, but it was the center of the room that stopped my breath. A large table was covered in maps of the city, but these weren't campaign maps. They were marked with surveillance routes, response times for local precincts, and dead zones, where the city's camera network failed. In the corner sat an old shortwave radio, its vacuum tubes cold, but its presence undeniable. She hadn't gone native. She had built a fortress. I opened the top drawer of the nearest cabinet. It wasn't filled with HOA violations. It was filled with Winters for Mayor flyers, but they were different. On the back of each one, in tiny, microscopic print, were the account numbers for the cell's offshore holdings. She was using the campaign mailers to move data. If anyone, a rival, a curious postman, a bored kid, looked too closely at those flyers, the entire SVR network in the United States would be dismantled by dinner time. She wasn't just a liability. She was a ticking bomb. I heard a floorboard creak outside. I killed the light and pressed myself against the wall, my hand instinctively reaching for the empty space at the small of my back where a Makarov should have been. The door opened. The amber light from the kitchen spilled across the floor, illuminating the silhouette of Ava Winters. She didn't look surprised. She looked weary. "A quiet pool is full of devils, Abe," she said, her voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Vtikom omut cherty vodyatsya." "I was just looking for the extra napkins," I said, my Abe voice sounding thin and ridiculous in the presence of that shortwave radio. "You were looking for a reason to kill me," she said. She stepped into the room and closed the door, plunging us into shadow. "You were looking at this room, and you see a crime. I look at this room, and I see the only thing that is real. Ava, the flyers," I whispered. "If the FBI sees the back of those mailers, the FBI is beating the buckets," she snapped. "They see a woman who wants to fix the potholes. They see a woman who wants to bring order to the chaos. They don't see the ghost. Only you see the ghost, Abe, because you are one too." She stepped closer, the scent of lavender and gun oil filling the small space. "The mountain does not meet the mountain. We are here, at the end of the world, in a pantry in the suburbs. What are you going to tell them? That I am too good at my job?" "I'm going to tell them the truth," I said. "That you've forgotten the mission." "The mission is dead," she hissed. "The mission is a soaked hen. I'm the mayor of this city, Abe. Or I will be. And once I am, I will be untouchable." She reached out and patted my cheek. It was the most terrifying thing she'd ever done. "Go back to the party. The bacon is getting cold. And symmetry, Abe. Remember the symmetry." I walked back into the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the smiling faces of the Kensington soft voters, And I realized I wasn't just watching a campaign. I was watching a hijacking. I went home and opened the dossier. I didn't write a note. I just pulled the for sale sign out from behind the back door and laid it on the kitchen table. The soup was almost cooked. The next morning, the strategy session was over, and the invasion had begun. Ava had moved from the pantry to the podium. The local community center was packed for the final mayoral debate. The air was thick with the smell of damp coats and cheap floor wax. I sat in the third row, dressed in my best Abe blazer, a corduroy monstrosity that suggested I enjoyed bird watching and early bird specials. Beside me sat a group of elderly residents from Kensington, all of them wearing Winters for Mayor buttons like they were badges of rank in a secret army. On stage, Ava's opponent, a developer named Henderson, was trying to talk about job growth. He was a big, bluff man who thought he could win with a firm handshake and a loud voice. He didn't realize he was up against a woman who had been trained to dismantle governments before he'd learned to shave. "My opponent wants to talk about freedom," Ava said, her voice cutting through Henderson's bluster like a surgical blade. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting flat on the lectern. But what is freedom without order? Is it the freedom to let your neighbor's peeling paint devalue your largest asset? Is it the freedom to let noise pollution rob you of your sleep? She was using the salami slice tactic. It was a classic Soviet negotiation move. You don't take the whole loaf at once. You just take one thin, undeniable slice at a time until the other side has nothing left. "Slice one," I whispered to myself. "Mr. Henderson's own properties," Ava continued, pulling a document from her folder with a flick of her wrist, "have 24 outstanding code violations. If he cannot manage a single apartment complex, how can he manage our city?" Henderson spluttered. "Those are minor administrative errors. Order is not administrative, Mr. Henderson," Ava snapped. Her eyes flashed with that cold, predatory light I'd seen in the Paris dossier. "Order is moral. To ignore a violation is to invite the rubbish heap. The appetite comes during the meal, and Mr. Henderson's appetite for chaos is well documented." She was glitched again, but the audience didn't care. They were leaning in. They loved the certainty. In a world of confusing politics, Ava Winters was offering them a cage, and they were eager to step inside as long as the bars were painted an approved shade of eggshell. I looked at the back of the room. Two men in dark suits were standing by the exit. They weren't locals. They had the look of federal investigators, or perhaps something worse. I felt a cold trickle of sweat slide down my spine. The SVR auditors were right. The spotlight was becoming too bright. "Slice two," I muttered. By the time the debate ended, Henderson looked like a man who had been hit by a train. Ava, meanwhile, looked energized. She looked like the woman who had walked out of Brussels in '94. She was high on the power, intoxicated by the way the crowd cheered for her zero-tolerance platform. I met her backstage as she was packing her notes. "You were brilliant, Ava," I said, my voice dry. "You've got them convinced that a cracked sidewalk is a sign of societal collapse." "It is a sign, Abe," she said, her voice a low, urgent hiss. She didn't look at me. She was staring at her own reflection in a small vanity mirror. "You start with the sidewalk. You end with the soul. I am fixing this city, one violation at a time." "The men at the back," I said, leaning closer. "The ones in the suits. They weren't here for the zoning talk. They were watching you, Ava. Not the candidate. The ghost." She froze. For a heartbeat, the salami slice confidence vanished, replaced by the old, jagged paranoia of the Cold War. "Let them watch," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I am going to be the mayor. Once I have the office, I will have the police. I will have the records. I will be the one who does the watching." "To sit on two chairs, Ava," I reminded her. "You're going to fall." "I'm not sitting," she spat, turning to face me. "I am climbing. And if you try to pull me down, Abe, I will show you where the lobsters spend the winter." "Ya tebe pokazu, GD Rocky Zimoyot." The ultimate Russian threat. She wasn't just warning me anymore. She was declaring war. I walked out of the community center into the cold night air. I didn't go to my car. I walked to a payphone 3 blocks away, an old relic I'd checked for bugs a week ago. I dialed a number that didn't exist in any directory. "The asset has achieved total identity bleed," I said when the line opened. "She is no longer operational. She is an active threat to the network, requesting final resolution." The voice on the other end was silent for a long moment. "Resolution granted. Clear the house, Abe. The van is on its way." I hung up the phone. I looked at the moon, hanging over the silent, orderly streets of Shady Oaks. I thought about the for sale sign on my kitchen table. The loaf was gone. There was nothing left to slice. The end of my career didn't come with a gunshot or a high-speed chase. It came because of a piece of brushed aluminum. On Monday morning, I decided to play the part of the perfect American one last time. I bought a flagpole. It was a modest thing, 3 meters of sturdy metal I intended to plant in the center of my front lawn. I figured a bit of patriotic window dressing would make the for sale sign less suspicious when it finally went up. It was my way of bowing out with a wink to the theater we'd both been performing for decades. I was halfway through tamping down the soil when the shadow fell across my work. "It is incorrect, Mr. Bond." I didn't even look up. I knew the cadence of those footsteps. I knew the way the air seemed to chill by 5 degrees when she stood behind you. "Morning, Ava. Just adding a little old glory to the streetscape. Thought it might help the neighborhood's visual flow." "The Shady Oaks Charter, Appendix C, subsection 12, she said, her voice as flat as a dial tone. "Flagpoles must be of a non-reflective, satin finish grade. Yours is brushed aluminum. It creates a glare hazard for motorists turning the corner of privet close. It is a violation." I stopped. I stayed on my knees, my hands covered in dirt, and I felt something in my chest finally snap. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. I looked at the pole. It was a beautiful, simple object. And she was standing there, a woman who had once navigated the fall of the Berlin Wall, telling me it was a glare hazard. "Ava," I said, slowly standing up and brushing the earth from my chinos. "The SVR is burning. Moscow is literally sending a cleaning crew to delete us. The FBI is sniffing around your Volga Strategic Shell Company. And you're talking to me about a glare hazard?" She didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the words SVR or Moscow. She just tapped her clipboard with her pen. "The fine is $500, Abe, and the pole must be removed within 24 hours. Not in my garden, Mr. Bond. I will not have this eyesore in my garden. Nevi moyem ogorod. Not my problem. Not on my watch." "You really don't get it, do you?" I asked, my voice dropping the Abe mask entirely. I stepped toward her, and for the first time, she actually took a step back. "The game is over. You lost the moment you started caring about the mulch. You think you're building a kingdom, but you're just building a coffin with very strict zoning laws." "I am the president," she hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure suburban rage. "I am the one who decides what is acceptable. You are a soaked hen, Abe. A man who sits on 2 chairs and thinks he can lecture me on power?" "I'm the man who was sent to save you," I said, my voice quiet and cold. "And I'm the man who just realized you aren't worth the effort. You aren't a legend anymore, Elena. You're just a nuisance." The name, Elena, hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, the pupils dilating until the slate gray was swallowed by black. For a second, I thought she might actually pull a weapon. Instead, she just scribbled furiously on her clipboard, her hand shaking. $750, she rasped, "for insubordination and failure to maintain neighborly decorum. I will have a lien on this house by sunset." She turned and marched away, her gait slightly uneven for the first time since I'd met her. The precision was gone. The legend was limping. I watched her go. Then I looked back at the flagpole. I didn't pull it out. I just left it there, leaning slightly to the left, a gleaming, brushed aluminum middle finger to the woman in number 369. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't go to the basement. I went to the kitchen and started making a pot of coffee. The Abe mask was in the bin. The Bond persona was packed away. I was just a man waiting for a van. The for sale sign was sitting on the counter. I picked up a marker and wrote "sold" across it in big, messy letters. It wasn't true yet, but in this neighborhood, reality was whatever you could get away with. I checked my watch. The election results would be in tomorrow. The extraction would follow shortly after. "The eyes are afraid," I muttered, looking out the window at Ava's perfectly trimmed hedges. "But the hands are doing." I sat down in the dark and waited for the sun to set on privet close for the second to last time. I spent Tuesday morning committing professional suicide. Or, more accurately, I committed the professional murder of Ava Winters. I sat at my kitchen table with a burner phone and a laptop that was currently screaming through a series of encrypted proxies. My task was delicate. I had to destroy Ava's political career without burning the SVR's fingerprints into the ashes. If I leaked her true identity, the FBI would swarm the street. But if I leaked her pettiness, the neighborhood would simply eat her alive. The mountain does not meet the mountain, Ava, I whispered, hitting the send button on an anonymous tip to the Shady Oaks Gazette and the city's lead political blogger. But the scandal always meets the candidate. The tip was simple: a detailed ledger of the beautification consulting fees. I hadn't included the offshore account numbers. That would have been too much light. Instead, I just showed how 6 figures of HOA dues had been funneled into a printing press that just happened to be churning out Winters for Mayor yard signs. By noon, the story was live. By 2 p.m., the local news vans were idling at the entrance of Privet Close, their satellite dishes pointing at the sky like accusing fingers. I stood by my window, hidden by the curtains, and watched the chaos. Ava's house was under siege, not by an extraction team, but by a reporter in a trench coat and a camera crew. To anyone else, it was a local interest story about a corrupt HOA president. To me, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Ava didn't hide. That wasn't her style. She marched out onto her porch at 3 p.m., her clipboard held like a shield. "These allegations are a visual obstruction to the truth," she shouted over the reporters. Her voice was shrill, the perfect Midwestern pitch finally cracking. "I have cultivated order in this city. I have ensured that every blade of grass is a testament to our collective discipline." She looked insane. The Karen had finally consumed the operative. She was defending her embezzlement not with legal arguments, but with the rhetoric of a lawn care tyrant. "Mrs. Winters," a reporter yelled, "is it true you used resident funds to pay for your own radio ads? The appetite comes during the meal, young man." Ava snapped, the Russian idiom spilling out like a confession. "If you want a city that functions, you must be willing to pay for the hand that holds the gavel." I watched her through my binoculars. Her face was flushed, her bun beginning to unravel. She was beating the buckets, trying to fight a PR war with tactical aggression. She didn't realize that in America, you can survive being a spy, but you can't survive being the woman who stole the neighborhood's roof repair fund. My phone chirped. A text from a blocked number. Audit complete. The result is negative. Extraction window opens at 2200 hours. It was over. The SVR had seen the news. They had seen their deep cover asset screaming about grass height on the 5 o'clock news and decided she was a soaked hen that needed to be plucked. I spent the next hour purging the house. I didn't use fire. I used the Abe method. I packed my sensible shoes. I folded my charcoal gray chinos. I wiped the hard drives and dropped them into a bucket of acid tucked inside a box labeled old paint. As the sun began to set, the news van started to pack up. The winter scandal was moving to the evening cycle. The street returned to its eerie, suburban silence. I walked out to my front lawn one last time. I took the sold sticker and slapped it across the for sale sign. Then, I walked over to my flagpole, the brushed aluminum one that had caused so much trouble. I didn't take it down. I just adjusted the flag so it hung perfectly straight. I looked over at number 369. The lights were off. The house looked dead. "To sit on 2 chairs, Ava," I said to the empty street. "I told you." I went back inside, sat on my packed suitcase, and waited for the clock to hit 10. I wasn't Abe Bond anymore. I wasn't even the man who had come to save her. I was just the last person who would remember that Elena Sokolova had once been something more than a footnote in a city zoning report. The evening of the election was unnervingly still. The news vans had retreated to City Hall to watch the numbers crawl in, leaving Privet close to the crickets and the shadows. I sat in my darkened living room, my suitcase by the door, watching the street through a gap in the blinds. The results weren't a surprise. By 8 p.m., the local radio station announced that Henderson had won in a landslide. Ava hadn't just lost the mayoralty, she'd become a punchline. The Winters doctrine had been rejected by the very people she thought she'd conquered. I saw her front door open at 8:45 p.m. She wasn't wearing the navy blazer or the power suit. She was wearing a trench coat I recognized from the Paris dossier, a relic from a life she'd tried to bury under layers of suburban mulch. She didn't look for reporters this time. She walked straight across her lawn, ignoring the "keep off the grass" sign she'd installed herself, and stepped onto my driveway. I met her at the door before she could knock. "It's over, Ava," I said. My voice sounded heavy, even to my own ears. She pushed past me into the darkened hallway. She didn't look like a president anymore. She looked like a woman who had spent 30 years building a house out of sand, only to watch the tide come in. Her bun had finally come undone, gray blonde strands hanging around a face that looked suddenly anciently tired. "The soup is eaten, Abe," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, the American lilt completely gone. "Time to wash the bowl. You stayed too long," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You forgot you were a guest." She turned to me, her eyes wet and wild. "I didn't forget. I just liked the air here. I liked that I could walk down the street and people were afraid of me for the right reasons. Not because I had a gun, but because I had the truth. I made this place perfect, Abe. I made it orderly. You made it a prison," I countered. "And you were the first person trapped in it." She let out a dry, hacking laugh. "And you, great Abe Bond? You're just a ghost who lived in my shadow. You think you're better because you kept your mask on? You're just a man with a suitcase and no home." She walked to the window and looked out at the street. "The van is coming, isn't it? I saw the silver sedan return. They aren't investigators. They're the cleaners. They're the audit," I corrected. "And your accounts didn't balance." Ava reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. She handed it to me. It wasn't a code or a bank account number. It was an HOA violation notice, filled out in her precise, elegant script. It was addressed to herself. "Reason for violation: failure to maintain cover. Fine. Everything." "I wanted to be the mayor," she said, looking at her house one last time. "I wanted to show them that we were better at this than they were, that we could build a world that didn't rot." "Everything rots, Ava, especially the lies." She straightened her shoulders then. The Karen vanished. The president vanished. For a fleeting second, Elena Sokolova stood in my hallway, the legend who had dismantled rings and moved through shadows. She gave me a sharp, military nod. "The mountain does not meet the mountain," she said softly. "But I suppose the rubbish heap eventually finds us all." She didn't wait for the van to pull into her driveway. She walked out onto the porch, sat down on her top step, and waited. She looked like a woman waiting for a bus that was running slightly late. I went back to my kitchen and checked the clock. 21:55. I didn't want to see it. I'd seen it too many times before. I went to the basement, pulled the master kill switch on my surveillance hub, and listened to the hum of the electronics die. The silence that followed was absolute. Upstairs, I heard the faint, heavy slide of a van door. There was no screaming, no struggle, just the sound of a vehicle pulling away, its engine fading into the distance until Privet Close was just another quiet street in a quiet town. I stood in the dark, clutching my suitcase, and wondered if she'd ever find out where the lobsters spend the winter. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of aggressive cheerfulness only a high-end suburb can muster. The sun hit the dew on the lawns, turning the cul-de-sac into a field of diamonds. And for the first time in months, there was no one on the sidewalk measuring the height of the grass with a ruler. I stood in my foyer, my suitcase and a single cardboard box at my feet. The house felt hollow, stripped of its electronic nervous system. I'd spent the last 3 hours ensuring that Abe Bond didn't leave so much as a dead skin cell or a stray encrypted packet behind. I walked out onto the porch. The silver sedan was gone. The black van was a memory. The street was empty, save for a lone jogger who waved at me as he passed. I didn't wave back. I didn't have to anymore. I walked over to the edge of my lawn and hammered my for sale sign into the dirt. Then, I walked across the property line to number 369. Ava's house looked abandoned in a way that felt permanent. I hammered a second sign into her lawn, right next to the Winters for Mayor sign that was now lying face down in the dirt. 2 houses, 2 signs, a matched set. A clean break then? The voice didn't come from behind me, but from the sidewalk. Mrs. Gable, the HOA secretary, was standing there. She wasn't wearing her usual jogging tracksuit or carrying her iPhone. She was dressed in a simple trench coat, her hands deep in her pockets, watching me with a look that was entirely too steady. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," I said, leaning on the mallet. I went for the Abe smile, but it felt thin. "Just wrapping things up. Cincinnati is calling me back." She didn't smile back. She walked closer, stopping exactly at the property line between my house and Ava's. She looked at the 2 signs, then up at me. "You did a very difficult thing, Abe," she said quietly. "Maintaining order is one thing. Maintaining equilibrium? That's something else entirely." I stiffened. "I'm just a guy who couldn't handle the drama, Mrs. Gable. Is that what we're calling it?" She tilted her head, her eyes fixed on mine. There was no suburban gossip in them now. "I've lived on Privet Close for 30 years. I saw Ava move in. I saw the way she never aged, the way she never talked about a hometown that actually existed. And then you arrive, a man with a generic name and a job that requires no travel, yet you have the hands of someone who has seen the world. She stepped onto my grass, ignoring the very bylaws she spent her life enforcing. We knew she was slipping, Mrs. Gable continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. The board. We aren't all just Karens with clipboards, Abe. Some of us appreciate a quiet street for very specific reasons. Ava became too loud. She started inviting the kind of light that burns everyone nearby. She reached out and patted my arm. Her hand was steady. Thank you, she said, for handling the situation so professionally. Shady Oaks is a much safer place now that the spotlight has been turned off. I imagine your superiors will be pleased with the resolution. I stared at her, the Abe mask finally shattering. I didn't know who Mrs. Gable worked for, or if she just belonged to a different cell entirely. But the message was clear. I hadn't been the only one watching. The forest is cut down, I said, testing the water. And the chips have finally stopped flying, she replied, finishing the thought with a sharp, knowing nod. Safe travels, Abe. She turned and walked away, her gait as precise and efficient as Ava's had ever been. I walked back to my car, tossing the mallet into the boot. I took one last look at the two houses. In the kitchen of 371, I'd left a single yellow slip of paper. Reason: unattended property. Fine. Paid in full. I got into the car and started the engine. It was a sensible, mid-sized sedan with a GPS that was currently programmed for a small town in Oregon where a man named Eric Abernathy was supposed to start a job at a local insurance firm. I checked the glove box. My new Social Security card was there. My new life was waiting. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. The 2-inch for sale sign stood side by side like headstones over the grave of a 30-year mission. Ava was gone, vanished into the machinery of a motherland that didn't believe in retirement. The forest is cut down, I muttered, the Russian words finally feeling right in my mouth. The chips fly. I turned the corner, leaving the Kentucky bluegrass and the expensive anxiety behind. I didn't look back. I had a long drive ahead of me, and I needed to practice my Eric laugh. It was going to be a very quiet neighborhood. I just hoped the dandelions knew how to behave, because I wasn't going to be the one to stop them. And that's Abe's story. I hope you enjoyed the change of pace in today's story. I've always been a fan of 1980s Cold War dramas, and this one was something I've been meaning to tell for a while. And once again, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments what sort of stories you'd like to hear. It's honestly the best way to help a small channel like this get noticed by the algorithm. I hope to see you in the next one.